Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tokenomics 101, what every executive needs to know before the next AI invoice. Thank you for joining us today. And before we get started, just a quick housekeeping note that this session is being recorded and will be shared out with you. And you can submit questions through the Q&A. Next, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today, Stephen Balusek, Executive Vice President of Solutions and Development Advisory and Pre-Sales, and Blain, Vice President of Technology and Innovation at Quisitive. Stephen and Bryan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're talking about something that's gone from a niche FinOps concern to a boardroom conversation in a very short 18 months, and that's the economics of AI consumption. We're calling this session today Tokenomics 101, what every executive needs to know before the next AI invoice hits. Or, in more slang terms, we're going from token maxing to tokenomics. And if that first word, token maxing, is new to you, don't worry. We're going to explain it. And honestly, it's a pretty interesting place to start, don't you think, Bryan?
Yeah, it really is, Stephen. And I'll say this up front. This is not all doom and gloom that your AI bill is going to explode. It's really, in many ways, kind of the opposite. There's new research emerging that would suggest that up to half of your AI bill can actually be reduced without compromising the quality. So the true story here isn't really, brace for the uncontrolled impact of your bill. It's that there's opportunity to reclaim money, and you should go after it.
Dude, really, that's the promise, Bryan. We're going to cover some recent history here today, how we got here, then what's actually changed in Microsoft's pricing model this year, because quite a bit has. We're also going to cover the cost drivers that no one budgets for, and then the good news, how much of that is recoverable and in what order. And after that, the questions that every leader watching should be able to answer: how to establish ownership and visibility, and a practical governance roadmap that you can start next week.
Exactly. But before we dive in, kind of one thing to hold in the back of your mind as you're watching this, and just ask yourself honestly, on a scale to 1 to 5, how confident would you be explaining to your organization's current CFO what your AI spend is and the value that you get?
So hold on to that number. We're going to come back to it at the end. And if this session does its job, as it should, then we'll definitely try to fix that number for you. So let's get into it. So, Bryan, this term token maxing, is that a real term, or where did it come from?
Yeah, it totally is a real term. And it's really a great case study in what happens when you optimize for the wrong metric. In distant history, 2025 and earlier this year in 2026, there is great pressure across the industry where everyone needs to be using AI. Prove that you're using AI. Do everything you can with AI. And a lot of organizations took that literally. And they started tracking like raw token consumption as a proxy or a metric for productivity.
Which means the more tokens that you burn, the more productive that you looked, I'm assuming?
Yeah, exactly. And it went even further than that. I mean, there's several large tech companies that started creating internal leaderboards of all their employees of who's actually using the most tokens. And so that's where we start getting into the term token maxing, because you're trying to maximize all the tokens that you're consuming.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that would be about as great as ranking developers by the lines of code that they're writing.
Yeah, pretty much. It's the same failure type of process, but a much bigger price tag, right? Because what happens if you have the wrong incentive, people are going to learn how to game it. And so when you have an incentive that says use more tokens, what's going to happen? People are going to start looking at how they get rewarded by creating processes and doing things that use more tokens, because that's the metric, not outcome, not value, but consumption. So what we've actually seen is this whole process was actually kind of shut down by a lot of the companies. They no longer have those internal leaderboards because it actually provided the wrong metric and led to a lot of waste.
So ultimately, what replaced it?
Yeah, so the industry is really doing kind of a course correction with this. At the last FinXX conference in June 2026 this year, the Linux Foundation backed the launch of the Tokenomics Foundation, which was built to really build and drive adoption for open standards for how we should measure and govern AI billing. So you're actually seeing this kind of transition, or token maxing is now dead. Long live value maxing.
Value maxing. I like value maxing. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's really the idea of how do we go from how many tokens do we use to what do those tokens actually produce? So it's how do we put the governance in place to turn AI consumption into something that the business ultimately cares about?
So, Bryan, that's the why now on the culture side, right? But there's also a very concrete why now inside the Microsoft ecosystem. Can you walk us through that now?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where some of the budgets start getting hit pretty directly. So Microsoft's been retooling some of their AI pricing this year, and it really kind of started with Copilot Cowork. That's kind of the whole new kind of agentic layer with multi-step orchestration and running and automation. It went GA earlier this year. Really no insight into what the consumption or how it was going to be licensed, but it was just start using it. But what's happened is it actually turned into this whole new concept of Copilot credits where, each credit ultimately results in like a penny. And so now you're getting into these consumption charges that are billed completely separate than your Copilot seat.
So what you're saying, the seat that I pay for doesn't really cover all that?
Correct. It's like, the seat's like a ticket. It gets you into the restaurant, but now you're paying for everything you're consuming. So with that, it's not always straightforward either what your cost is going to be because it depends on several different variables. What model is being used, what organizational context or data that's being consumed and retrieved, how many tools and connectors it's calling, how long it's running. So it's not just for a single variable. It's multiple variables that are ultimately getting to how many credits you're using, which then gets you to how much it's costing you. So it's not a flat number anymore. And then from there, it wasn't just, Copilot Cowork. GitHub Copilot has also gone over to a consumption-based plan. So it doesn't matter whether you're on Business, Enterprise, Pro Plus, all that's been moved over to AI credits. And, credits where it's looking at your input and your output and the cache and really how many tokens are you consuming and using. And this really kind of brings those in line with, how Microsoft's always looked at like Azure Foundry, which has always been kind of per token and consumption based. But then on top of that, you have some other introduction, things Microsoft's introduced with how you can actually purchase a lot of things like with the agent pre-purchase plans where you can get into like commit units and where you pay for them up front. And then you have flexibility, how those get kind of consumed across Foundry and Copilot credits. So quite a few changes that are going on.
And added to all that, Bryan, there's this new licensing tier on top of all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's where Microsoft introduced the whole new 365 E7 license, which went GA earlier this year, $99 a month retail. And that's where it's bundling E5 and Copilot and Agent 365 and the interest suite. I mean, it's a good value when you're using all four components, and it does give you some extra benefit, especially with like the Agent 365. But, there's another thing that a lot of organizations don't, always understand too. It's not just the license impact, but it's also the compute impact as well. So we start getting into like long running agents. That's a whole separate consumption, not just Copilot or Foundry, but all your Azure infrastructure costs that goes with that.
So ultimately, you can buy the license. You can feel like you've budgeted for AI, but yet you're still going to be exposed.
Yeah, exactly, Steve. And it's really going from we bought a seat that gives us access to a product to now it's all consumption based for a lot of this stuff. It's kind of like what we went through like over a decade ago when we're going from CapEx to OpEx, when we're going from on-premises infrastructure to cloud-based infrastructure. And that journey took many, many years. AI is really condensing that time frame down to months.
Which is a crazy fast runway for finance teams to try and build a forecasting model.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why a lot of organizations are having this type of conversation now and not later, because later might be too late.
Yeah, so Bryan, let's get concrete now. If someone watching gets an AI bill that's higher than they expected, what's actually going on under the hood?
Yeah, so the biggest driver is really going to be what is the model used and how many tokens are flowing through it. Because that is the biggest driver for most AI bills. In fact, it is what a lot of people don't even realize. It's all really model choice. And you can actually use different models and they're going to have different cost models there. In fact, Gartner did a study or they went through and did a lot of model swapping to get to a particular outcome, and using like smaller and mini models still produce the results, but you're looking at a 5 to 35, 30x cost savings just by using a different model.
Well, that's not a rounding error. That's a difference between a line item and a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the real crux of it, is most of the work being done doesn't require the latest frontier reasoning models. When you're looking at classifications, summarizations, and other things, you don't need to overpay for that work. And there's other models that can do it just as easy, and they're not overqualified for it, and they're not going to cost you all the extra money.
So knowing which model to use for which task is in itself a cost control, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It is probably the first cost control, but it's also one that's hard to keep up with. If you look at all the new models, I mean, they're constantly coming out. Each new week seems to be some type of new story about this model now has all this extra power. And so people naturally gravitate towards that because they think the newer models can be more capable, and so they want to use that. And that's why we push towards a center of excellence, where you have kind of that governing body that can say, here's the types of models you should use for the type of work that you're doing. It's kind of a core aspect of our managed AI program, because so many organizations just can't keep up with the constant change. And this is an area where it can have a big impact on cost.
All right, so number one, right model for the job. What's next?
Yeah, I would say agent compute. Like if you're running your agents hosted in Foundry, you're not just paying for tokens, you're paying for the containers they run in. You're looking at all the other kind of infrastructure that's around there, which really gets into, what's the organizational content that you're pulling into. Are you using like Foundry IQ? Are you going to Fabric, pulling stuff in from SharePoint? What are you doing? All that extra stuff starts adding to the context. It starts adding, into the cost as well.
Yeah, so the smart part of the agent, knowing your business, costs extra on top of the thinking part, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but that's really where you get the power of the models, right? You need to ground it in your business, but you need to be very, call it strategic with that data, because you don't want to give it too much data or too little data. But that's not where it stops either. Then you get into what we call more like an enterprise wrapper, right? You start looking at logging and traceability, observability, everything you want to know. What was being done? Is it being used correctly? Do we have the right controls in place? So a lot of times people will budget for some of the AI tools, but they don't always, budget for all the things that go around what makes it production quality. AI makes it easy to produce proof of concept, and you don't care about these things in proof of concepts. But in production, it's real, necessary, and does cost money.
Now, I imagine there's also a capacity planning trap in here too.
Yeah, there is, because with a lot of it, it's really determining how are you going to pay for it, right? Are you going to go through and do a reserve capacity because you need that capacity? Microsoft doesn't have unlimited capacity on the regions. Different models are going to have different capacity, and so if you're relying on it, you might need to reserve that and go with what's called a PTU, provision through unit. Or if you're doing pay as you go, I mean, there's all these different variables that kind of go into it. And you can over provision, under provision, pay more or less. So, understanding what you need and how to pay for it becomes pretty critical.
So what about the human side? Anything that isn't technical?
Yeah, I think there's a couple, and they kind of go off one another. The first, shadow AI, because IT departments generally are kind of, we'll call it constrained and have a lot of demands. The rest of the org is, standing up stuff and going around IT and IT controls and visibility. And so a lot of times you don't know the tech, you don't know what the exposure is, you don't know the risk, and a lot of times you don't know the cost until you get some unexplained expenses hitting, finance. Mm-hmm. And then the second part kind of ties into that, the business is going down that route because it's the belief that they can save time and generate value by using AI. And so it kind of almost goes back to the whole token maxing behavior, where it's encouraging adoption and use without necessarily tying it to value.
And I'm assuming this is not just a Microsoft phenomenon?
No, it's really not. I mean, for almost every vendor out there. Everyone's layering in their own AI capabilities, whether it's vertical or industry specific solutions into their own products. A lot of those are also going to be consumption based with that meter going. And so it just kind of compounds the sprawl, the governance, the risk, the security, because now you have your AI spend and tech kind of spreading out all over the place.
So Bryan, the pattern is what?
I would say budgeting for license is kind of one thing, but no one's really budgeting for the entirety of all the AI that's there, the infrastructure, the production, the governance, the logging, the observability, everything that's needed to really understand what's there. And that's really gets to your total AI budget.
So Bryan, you opened up this whole session saying that it isn't a doom and gloom talk, right? So let's cash that check. How much of this is actually recoverable?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Stephen. Gartner actually released a study here recently. I think it was just within the last couple of weeks, where they say up to 50% of a typical AI bill could be reduced without loss of quality, and that's really before you start getting into hardcore trade-offs. And it really works through, we'll call it just like a kind of a tiering or ladder-based approach for the work.
So 50% with no quality loss is a pretty big claim.
Yeah, it is. That's a big number, right? But it checks out. I mean, if you think about going back to what we were just discussing, most tasks do not require frontier intelligence in a large reasoning model. And that becomes like a huge, enormous waste. And Gartner even did a study with that where they compared two different AI companies with, pretty much identical revenue. And they started looking at the model selection. Just because of how one used models and would actually use different models, more tailored models versus just pure frontier models, it actually led to a 35-point margin difference for their company. So model selection is huge.
I would say so. So really, it's not a technology gap at all.
No, it's really not. And there's different approaches to that. I mean, we just touched on Gartner. They actually, part of their approach is that whole staged, where you start off where they kind of say you're renting your technology, where in essence, that's where a lot of people are, right? You have all these different licenses, all this different consumption. You don't really customize anything. You're just using what's out there. But a lot of people don't know what's there. So kind of step one at that foundation is to really understand what you have, what you're using, to determine the cost, who's actually using it, what the work's being done, and really going through and just, again, that inventory to know what's there, because in order to start trimming it, in order to start actually looking for value and tuning it, you need to know what's there. So that's where you can start actually then, now you know what's there, go through and provide the guidance back to the company of, hey, you've been using these models. We see that in the usage. Why aren't you using some of the smaller models? Why do you need all the large, latest, greatest models, the frontier models? And so it allows you to start having that feedback. And from there, it continues to go up. And each kind of rung you will, or each step, each stage you go up, you have additional savings, but you also have additional engineering complexity and so forth, because now you're really kind of building and tailoring things to your organization.
Great points, Bryan. Before we move on, but what's the catch? Because cut half your bill usually comes with one.
Yeah, there's no free lunch, right? So every time you make a change, there can be an impact on model behavior. Not all models are the same. So before you just arbitrarily say, everyone go over to this model, you do need to go through and test and make sure you're getting the results that you desire and need for what your business use case happens to be.
So the quality gate ultimately comes before the cost cutting, not after.
Exactly. Because else you could just be cutting costs and then killing quality and actually not getting the value that you need. So it's really going from measuring and then moving. And so this is where, especially as you go up that kind of that rung, if you will, all those different ladders, that's where you'd see more like Azure Foundry come into the mix, where you have a lot more control on the models, the selections, the routing, the caching, etc. And so, it's really getting into that. But again, you got to start somewhere, which is understanding what you have.
All right, Bryan. So let's shift gears just a little bit and turn this into something that people can use right now. If you're a business or IT leader watching, what should they already be able to answer today about their own organization?
Yeah, I think there's probably 5 to 6 questions, Stephen, that
Okay.
we really need to understand as IT leaders within our org. Like, number one, who ultimately owns the AI cost and accountable for it? Is it IT? Is it finance? Is it a business unit? Or is it like a shared model across the company itself?
And if the answer is nobody, that's pretty much a diagnostic in itself, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. I think that's kind of like a high priority, right? Is defining who ultimately is accountable for the AI cost spend itself. And then from there, once you have that, where's that consumption and that cost coming from? Which teams, which use cases, which agents, which software is actually driving those numbers?
Yeah, we see agentic sprawl on just about every client that we walk into, which is why we created our agentic sprawl offer, which we'll talk about at the end of the session here today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Simon. It's something we see constantly, right? And it's an area that's easy to understand because the administrative tooling really hasn't caught up with a lot of the end user enablement and tools. The gap's starting to close. You can see it with like Agent 365, the new Copilot cost management. So you do have some progress that's going on and some even insights into shadow AI discovery capabilities, but it's not completely there yet. And then 3, how are you actually paying for your AI? Is it pay as you go? Are you making commitments? Does your actual usage match what you've committed to? Are you overcommitted? Are you under provisioned? And so it's going through and constantly evaluating what you projected against actuals to see, is there opportunity for cost savings there and correction?
All right, number 4.
Yeah, it kind of ties back into that, right? It's really visibility into all this and actually having budgets and limits put in place. And that's one of the things that can cause a bill to really run rampant is if you don't have a good budget in place to limit the spend and limit, something that could be out of control. A new model comes out, someone starts running something, not realizing the impact to the token. So understanding where the budget caps need to be and how to manage that and actually share that back out is pretty powerful, right? It's the difference of having a dashboard versus actually having something that's being monitored and reported on and action taken away.
Number 5.
Yeah, so this is I think where the industry is really going, right? Is how do you measure value? Not just volume, but now the value. Can you point to the business outcome, the time saved, the revenue influenced, and tie it back to how you actually got there with the technology itself? A lot of organizations skip this, but it really gets down to how we should be developing within our prospective businesses anyways, is, we shouldn't just be doing something for the sake of technology, but looking at what value does it actually bring to our organization.
All right, Brian, bring it home with the bonus question.
Yeah, so this is the fun one, right? Is do we know all the AI that is actually running in our environments? You start looking at the teams, the business units, how much have they stood up on their own? How prolific is the shadow AI and what is that exposure? And I think probably most organizations would say we probably don't know completely all the AI that's being used.
So I'd ask everybody on the call right now watching this is just to run those questions through your head. How many could you answer right now without going to check with somebody else?
Yeah, and if the answer is like 0, 1, and that's really okay. And that's where a lot of organizations are today. I mean, AI's kind of caught a lot of the industry, a lot of the businesses kind of off guard with just how much it's advanced, how quickly it's been actually embraced and used. And a lot of the disciplines, how to actually look at it, how to model it, how to embrace it, are still fairly new. And so it's not to feel like you're behind. It's just to say, here's where you're at. And then how do you actually get to where you want to go?
So Brian, let's dig into that first question that you posed there around ownership. Is there like an industry standard model yet for actually who's in charge?
The funny thing is, if you had asked me like 2 months, 3 months ago, it said, probably not. But we actually see some changes going on within the industry. And we start seeing one in particular is starting to get some heavy adoption. And the issue is a lot of people just aren't aware and it hasn't caught up. So if you look at like the FinOps Foundation, it did formally publish the FinOps for AI scope within their framework. And so it goes through and defines the personas, the domains, capabilities, KPIs, kind of everything that you need to really understand and manage and govern AI within an organization. And we see a lot of companies starting to kind of gravitate towards that as a standard.
But what does the model actually say?
Yeah, so it goes through and from like personas, right? You have like your FinOps practitioner, your engineering, your finance, your product procurement, and leadership. In practice, that really comes down to like your CIO or your CTO leading the technical and consumption side, finance owning budget discipline and forecasting, business unit and product leaders who are going to be accountable for whether their spend is actually producing value or not. Procurement, because there's actually spend and new vendors going on and needing to kind of understand and manage that.
And a body ultimately that pulls it all together?
Yeah, and that really comes under like the leadership, right? So you get into like the concept of like an AI investment council, like a steering committee. So it's every persona's responsibility where you're going through. You have a cross-functional team that can approve, evaluate, track AI projects. Yeah, look at is it actually aligned with the value that you want? Is it aligned with your strategic direction and your strategy? And how does how do you ensure consistency? How do you ensure that all your enterprise standards are really being met? And so it's a way to put the right governance in place to really unlock the right innovation to drive value.
So Bryan, without this framework, as you're visiting with our customers, what's the failure mode that you really see most out there?
Yeah, there's not really a single owner or organization or entity within a business that owns it. It's kind of like this proverbial hot potato. Is it IT? Is it finance? A lot of times, someone assumes someone else is actually watching it, or just IT has it alone, but you don't have the business side accountability or the understanding of what the business is doing to really tie back to the build to see should it be done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's also this wrinkle here about who's even building the stuff.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting, right? Because the one thing generative AI has actually done is really reduce the barrier to innovation, right? So you can have people who did not come up through the development ranks who can now actually have models create just rich code and solutions, agents and workflows and so forth. And so now they're kind of doing this whole engineering persona, but they didn't come up through the engineering ranks and aren't familiar with like governance or FinOps a lot of times.
Which means policy by itself will never reach them.
Exactly. So it's going to be a combination of things. It's going to be education. It's going to, start looking at, how do you go from nice to have to something that's a true core capability? We don't want to police kind of the rogue actors necessarily within our organization. They're trying to get their job done, but how do we actually bring our organization along and really introduce them to disciplines that they haven't encountered before? Because they do have things they want to provide. They do want to provide value, but we got to make sure it's done in a way that doesn't actually introduce organizational risk.
So let's pivot just a bit, talk about the tooling. Bryan, do organizations build visibility from scratch, or is Microsoft giving them something now to help with that?
Yeah, so like we were discussing just a few minutes ago, the tooling is improving, but it's not quite where most enterprises want it. If you look at like the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you have the cost management dashboard in there. It gives you like your real-time Copilot credit consumption. You can drill down by user. You can go through and put in your budgets. You can see, how much someone's going against the budget. But that's kind of thing one. It's not really all that shareable. Then, if I want to look at, Foundry, well, that's a completely different area, different place I have to go get information, or GitHub consumption, a whole nother area I have to go get all the information, or if I have my third-party vendors. So you have all these different places you can go for that one license, for that one, kind of consumption of that product. but you don't really have this like centralized view of how all the AI is being spent and where it's being spent, who's assigned what. And so it's just, you don't quite have as much visibility into it. I mean, that's why we've kind of built our own IP that we use here, is so we can kind of track who is using what, because it is a need.
So Bryan, with that many places to look, who actually has the responsibility to look?
Yeah, and so that really gets in kind of policy and process decisions organizations need to make, right? Because I would say the biggest common failure I see, Stephen, is no one's really been assigned to review the spend, the dashboards on an ongoing basis. No one's accountable for following up what's there. But I think that's also where we see, going back to kind of the FinOps for AI framework, and even we see Microsoft come along with their agreement to really embrace the Focus 1.4 standard for how you can look at cost and usage specifications for unified reporting to get that consistent view. And so it's getting visibility to that, to where now you can start making informed decisions and holding people accountable.
All right, last piece. What does good accountability then look like day to day?
Yeah, and I think that's really getting back to where the kind of the show back, the chargeback models. So you're attributing the spend to the business unit, to the application, to really where that usage is generating from. So you can actually see the total economic value, the total ROI, and making sure everything's in place to where it's being reviewed on a constant basis. Because especially as things change, it's not just do it once and then come back later, but you need to do it often.
So how often? Why monthly specifically?
Yeah, I mean, the FinOps guidance for AI, definitely says do it much, more frequently, right? Because you have so much change. You have shorter forecasting windows. You need to have more budget revisions because the tech changes very fast. Charges can change very fast. Vendor pricing models can change very fast. And so just kind of looking at it once of here's our budget and let it go off. If you wait till a year is transpired, you could be completely far away from your budget. So you need to have much more rigorous schedules of checking your actuals against your budgets and making course corrections.
Awesome. Great information, Bryan. So to recap, it's making sure there's clear ownership, there's clear visibility, there are clear standards and accountability that must be in place.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, let's make this actionable for everyone. If someone's watching thinking we need to build this from scratch, where do they start and what order?
Yeah, so I think, I would say 5 phases. Phase 1 kind of gets back to some of the stuff that we've talked about, is you got to know what's out there. You need to go through and catalog your AI surface, right? Your Copilot seats, your Copilot co-work usage, Microsoft Scout, tying into GitHub usage. What's in Azure Foundry? What's the enterprise kind of, we'll call it, wrap around your AI? What are you doing in like Copilot? What's your third-party products? Everything that you're already using within the enterprise, finding the shadow AI stuff, getting it together, getting that inventory, that map to know what's being consumed. Because if you don't know what you have, then you're not going to be able to manage it.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about phase 2?
Yeah, that really gets back into, I would say, defining ownership, right? So who owns the workloads? Who owns, going through and determining if something should be invested in or not? Are you looking at, a cross-organizational like AI investment council that has representation from IT, procurement, and business, to where they can go through and have like that holistic view to see, does it align with what we need to do?
Absolutely. Number 3?
Yeah, again, back to visibility. What are the budgets? How are the different organizations, teams, departments tracking against those budgets? Having alerting in place, having hard caps to where you have budgetary enforcement, and then going through and letting people see where that's at, and making sure you have kind of the tagging and rigor in place to where you can actually tie usage back to those teams.
And 4?
Yep, it's going to be back to policy, right, and guardrails. A lot of the stuff that IT likes, but it's making sure we're actually looking at the right tools for the job. Are we right sizing the model selection? Are we looking at how we buy our software? Are we doing pure like pay as you go retail pricing? Are we doing capacity planning? Are we doing pre-commits? And a lot of that, to do rightly, you kind of need to know what you have, but you need to constantly kind of build that in to make sure you're doing it correctly.
Awesome. The fifth phase is really the one I think that closes the loop.
Yeah, it's just tying the spend to the value. And that's really not I would say something you just finish, right? That's an ongoing operation that needs to be embraced. It needs to be, how are you defining your KPIs? How are you looking at value for spend? And so that becomes pretty critical.
Yeah, KPIs are super critical. So why don't you share with the audience here which ones really matter the most?
Yeah, and these are some of the ones that the FinOps for AI have highlighted, and there's a sense for it, right? You look at like cost per inference, so the total inference cost, which is divided by like the number of requests, right? So if you spend $5,000 across like 500 requests, well, that kind of tells you how much you're getting charged per request. So that starts giving you visibility. If we go from 500 requests and it's costing us X, and now we scale that to 50,000 requests, well, now we start getting some views into what that's going to cost. So the next one I would look at would be kind of cost per token. So you look at your total tokens cost divided by your tokens used, and that kind of gives you like a normalizing metric. So you can actually do model comparisons. If I have one work I'm going to throw against like an Opus, we'll call it 5 model, and I want to turn it over and throw it against a 5, and I can get the same results. I can actually now see my token costs for that work and really start making some more wise model selection choices. And then the other one, I'd say, really gets into the time to achieve the business value, right? So you're looking at what's your break-even point to do the work any other way. And so when you start looking at if we're doing the current way versus, or maybe a traditional way versus an AI way, what is the true ROI for this, and is it even worth doing?
And how do you define that ROI?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just the industry standard, right? You're going to look at your benefit minus your cost over cost. It's just kind of like, we'll call it the straightforward formula that everyone uses, but it's really a way to determine what is your value that you're going to have from that. And ultimately, that's what we want, is we want that value. And that really should be part of the AI Investment Council, is making sure the right information has been collected to do your ROI calculation, so you can actually have a fair analysis of what's being presented to do.
So Bryan, in summary, the discipline is just review cost per outcome, not just cost per token.
Correct. It's every governance cycle, right? If you want to look at something that's high consumption and low outcome, that's probably a signal that you may not need it. It needs to be retired. It needs to be rescoped. So it's really just a lot of the decisions organizations are going to have to make as they start looking at their AI projects and spend.
Yeah, really, in my opinion, this last phase kind of feels like the whole thesis of this talk.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of organizations started getting kind of burned by token maxing, where it was like adopt AI at all costs, you're going to fall behind, and kind of the whole metric around rewarding use and usage without really planning for value, right? It's AI itself is going to provide value without really saying, well, should we use it, or what value are we hoping to achieve from this? I mean, governance in and of itself doesn't stop innovation. It's what allows you to actually do innovation with confidence and at scale, because now you know who owns it, what the value is, what the cost is, what the risk and security requirements are. So it's one of those things that really is necessary.
Bryan, before we wrap here, let's go ahead and rapid fire through some of the questions that our viewers sent. I was actually really impressed, just given the number of registrants, obviously a hot topic, and they even sent some questions in advance for us to kind of go through. So I want to make sure that we answer those here today.
All right.
So first, we get hit with this crazy Copilot co-work bill that we didn't expect. What exactly happened?
Yeah, you look at how co-work was launched. all of a sudden you couldn't have it unless you actually put in a spending policy. But what happens is, it's always going to be what was being done, right? You go back to the formula, what model was being done, what context was used, what tools were being used, how long was it running. So it's that use without any budget caps to restrict, the limit of how far it could actually run away. And really, I would say even kind of the training and the feedback to the organization to say, okay, you just started doing everything in co-work, where you could have actually used like Copilot Research or Analyst or some other tools. Why did it really need to be in the latest, greatest, most expensive tech that was out there?
So we get this one a lot, especially considering Copilot with both a license cost and a metered usage cost. Is it cheaper really just to build it on Foundry?
Yeah, so I'm going to throw my old consulting head on and say it depends, right?
All right.
When you start looking at it, it comes down to what are you trying to achieve? Well, what's the workload? How much control do you need? Do you need all that granularity, the model of choice, the routing, the controls, very predictable kind of, we'll call it workflow and outcomes that you're trying to achieve that's going to be at scale? Or is it something that's Copilot could easily do and it's already got like work IQ built in and you don't need it to do it? So it really comes down to what is the task and choosing the right technology to get the outcome that you're looking for.
All right, so the next one, this was going to be near and dear to your heart, considering you run Quisitive's IT department. But how do we stop teams from going around you to spin up their own AI tools?
Yeah, I can tell you, from experience, policy rarely solves this one by itself. It's going to be visibility, Stephen. Unless leaders and the organization can see what's being used, where things are at, what licenses have been procured outside of procurement and IT, you don't have that, right? And then so you've got to get that visibility to really understand your shadow AI. And so there's a lot of things that we do to get insight into that and have conversations with different business units, and we understand why they're wanting to do that, but we also need to make sure we're doing that in a way that is corporately responsible. And so we want to make sure we give them that path. Sometimes it's well-meaning. They didn't know there was governance in place and they're just under pressure to get something done. So there's a lot of things. And so for me, it's understanding what's there and having those conversations and getting people aligned and part of the process and committed to it.
All right, next one. Should we commit to reserve capacity, with PTU, ACUs, or max, or just stay in a pay-as-you-go model?
Yeah, so it's a great question. A lot that organizations kind of struggle with. We often will start with the pay-as-you-go because a lot of times people don't understand what's being done, what's being used, or it may not be optimized. So, without understanding, is it something that should be done? Without understanding, is there room for optimization? You could actually be doing a reserve capacity that might be incorrect. And so that's where we want to go through, get that understanding and look what's there, start optimizing so that when we do, move off like a pay-as-you-go and do commitments, or we need some reserve capacity, we're doing it in an informed posture and making the right decisions. So else we could actually be doing a little bit more harm if we don't actually have that insight.
Yeah, it's a really good catch, Bryan. What you're saying ultimately is optimize first and then commit.
Correct. Because if not, you could just actually be locking in waste.
All right. The last one, the one we get asked more than any other, who should actually own this budget line?
Yeah, I think that really goes back to the FinOps for AI framework, right? It's a shared ownership. You're looking at, the IT, the CIO, being on the technical and the consumption side. You're looking at finance on budget discipline and, what should the budget actually be, what the business can afford. Product and business owners having a responsibility and accountability for what they're going to use and consume to get to the outcomes that they say they can get. And then procurement to make sure things are actually aligning with organizational standards. If if it's nobody's job, then there's a failure. If it's IT's job alone with no business accountability, then there's also a little bit of a failure there. So that's where you want to get into that kind of that shared perspective and responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right now, Bryan, I think we're going to bring it home. And, if they remember anything from today, ultimately, what would those things be?
Yeah, I think thing number one, see, going to be get visibility, right?
Yeah.
You can't govern what you can't see, and you can't optimize it either. So, getting to that understanding and the measurement to know what's there, how it's being used, who's using it, the work that's being done, all the different vendors that are, actually in the mix, get all that completely understood to the best of your ability.
Yeah. And second thing, which I think is really the real headline.
Yeah, I think, there's room to recover cost, right? What we see is so many organizations are just going with the latest frontier models, and they're actually using more power than that's actually needed for the work, right? So it's going through and looking at how do you optimize the tools that you have to use the right tool, the right model for the job, so you stop overpaying for stuff that you don't need.
Absolutely. The bigger picture takeaway from all that, the industry has already learned this lesson once in public with the whole token maxing story that we covered in the beginning, right? Token volume without outcome measurement always backfires. So it's important. Don't wait for your own version of that moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where you just want to shift to focusing on the value that's provided as quickly as possible. And so, with that, I would also say don't try to invent your own framework for this. Look what's already being out there within the marketplace with adoptions like the FinOps for AI, and align to that. Don't try to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. So wanted to thank everyone here for spending time with Bryan and I here today. Hopefully this was an informative session for you just around this topic of Tokenomics 101. A lot of great points here today. We will obviously be sending out this content at the close of this session. At Quisitive, we've developed a methodology and an approach for what we call managed AI adoption. This includes establishing the right guardrails around security, governance, and also this very important topic of FinOps that we discussed today. And it all starts with an agentic sprawl offer that we can come in that's aimed at identifying the proliferation of agents within your company and helping you devise a strategy for managing identity, security, and the financial impact that those agents are having within your company. We've included information on both of these offers. There's a QR code that you can scan right there. If you're interested in any of this information, we would certainly love to hear from you. All the questions that are submitted here, just for the sake of time, we're going to summarize all those, and we'll get those answers back out to you for those who attended the session here today. We certainly appreciate your time and attention. Courtney?
Thank you, Bryan and Stephen, for a great session. If you guys would like to join us for part 2, the link is in the chat where you could register, or scan the QR code and register for part 2. We hope to see you there. And lastly, we would love your feedback. If you could just take a second to submit this quick form, which the link is also in the chat, you could be submitted to win $100. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on September 23rd.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a good day.